Woo! All right, happy Halloween. Yeah, all right. I know there's a few people with a couple of costumes or related wear, and that's awesome. And I hope you're excited, not just for Halloween, because we're here to talk about a really important and exciting topic in itself, user onboarding. Yes, the process of acclimating someone new into our product or service. Yes, onboarding. It's that word that we use when we start designing something or exploring something that comes with the promise of carrying our new users upwards on the path to retention and engagement. And at some point, we'll declare, let's design onboarding, and we'll start conjuring up images of welcome screens, and we'll ask ourselves, how should we begin with a new user? But I'd like us to start today by thinking about the end. I want each of you to be thinking about this question throughout the next 25 minutes or so. Where, in your current product experience, does user onboarding end? And while you think about your answer to that question, I'll share with you where I used to think onboarding ended. I used to think it ended with a screen like this, something that says you're all set after you set up a piece of hardware or software. And that's because in my first real design job, I was responsible for creating setup wizards for printers and copiers. I know, real exciting stuff. But I was told that this was the most important thing to do because it would reduce customer returns if we had a good setup flow. So I would spend days, if not weeks, perfecting instructions for steps telling people how to connect cables into the backs of their printers. And I would design a beautiful "you're all set" screen at the very end to wish them on their merry futures with their new devices, thinking my job was done. But of course, as I got into the world of app, website, and other digital experience design, I realized that that approach didn't scale because in our digital products, usage scenarios are constantly evolving, and it's very easy for someone to abandon a digital experience at any time. So we can't just limit their onboarding to something as short-lived as setup. Yet, that's exactly what many of us do when we set out to design onboarding. We focus so much on solving the beginning that that's all we build. And we shortchange our users by ending onboarding too soon, typically after the first run experience. And it's tempting to do this, right? Because first run is a defined moment in time, something we can guarantee all new users will see at least some part of. So if we do it really well, maybe we can point to it as a beautiful standalone piece of work in our portfolios. And don't get me wrong, those first impressions, they are important, but not if they come at the expense of long-term support. Because if we focus just on designing the first run experience, we're just designing something akin to a new employee's first day of orientation at a new company, right? It's just a single event, presented in a one-size-fits-all manner, and therefore it can only ever achieve short-term logistics, like getting people to sign paperwork or sign up. But true onboarding is so much more, because it will support people through multiple events in their journeys through our products. It will help people using diverse methods because people come to our products in different situations. All so that it can blend into a long-term approach to guidance in our products. After all, retention, engagement, and metrics like those are long-term goals, so we need to get our users beyond short-term logistics. So in today's session, I'm going to help you make the case back to your teams on why you need to design onboarding that has some longevity. And we'll start by first looking at those multiple events over the customer journey when onboarding can do its job. Now, most people think of onboarding as having a specific job. Can someone shout out what they think onboarding's job is? Anything? Oh, maybe you don't know. One that commonly gets attributed to onboarding is that it needs to familiarize someone with a product or service. Show of hands if this resonates with your understanding. Yeah, a fair number of folks. But it also has some other things it needs to do. It needs to learn about a new user so that it can help tailor an experience to their needs. It may need to convert them in some form or fashion, which means maybe getting them signed up, subscribed, or into an otherwise committed state. And it needs to guide them on their next steps to becoming engaged and successful in our product. That's an insurmountable list of jobs to do if onboarding is only given the first run in which to do them. Good employers know this. When they design their new employee onboarding programs, they're thinking about activities in terms of months, not minutes. And even if we don't have to design user onboarding to take 6 months, we do need to break it out of that narrow window of the first run experience so it can do its jobs more effectively. So let me share with you one example of a product trying to do just that. Here's how Airtasker, a platform for helping people post tasks and get hired for tasks, helps tackle onboarding beyond the first run experience. It starts with a rich landing page experience aimed at familiarizing someone with its product or service. This includes familiarizing them with the categories of work it can support, along with some familiarization about the process and how it works, and introducing some real people who work in the community to start building trust. But perhaps one of the best ways that Airtasker starts familiarizing new users with its service is by letting people explore active tasks in progress. People can browse or search for tasks similar to the one that they might want to post or get hired for, and being able to see these details and how things are working helps explain to them how this works in a much easier and in-context way than if they were tried to be explained this abstractly with other examples. And the nice thing here is that even though some users might be ready to commit to posting or responding for a task right away, Airtasker knows that some people might not be ready to commit to this after just the first run experience. So they have a little action in place that someone can take if they're not quite ready. They can choose to follow one of these tasks. This allows them to get updates on the task as it runs its course, keeps them connected to the platform while they make a decision about whether they want to commit to it or not. And this also gives Airtasker the opportunity to learn about what matters to this user. It can ask them whether they're more interested in posting a task or getting hired for one, and it also understands the category of task they're interested in, so it can tailor its updates to them as the task runs its course. And even after the task is completed, there is a way for a user to then kind of get moved from that following a task state into converting, because it will then change state and show that someone can now take that task that has just ended, that they were following, and post a similar one, which allows them to jump right into a post flow with information pre-populated. Again, much easier than asking someone to commit and start a posting from scratch. And even after someone converts, posts their first task, Airtasker does not stop its guidance. It continues guiding them through next steps, not just for the task they just posted, but even after that's completed. It will continue guiding them by reminding them about different categories of new tasks that they can go ahead and post, giving them discounts on another task they might want to post. It just keeps them kind of engaged with the platform and reminding them what more it can help do for them. And throughout this experience, it continues reinforcing all of these categories that it can support. One, because they know when people realize that this is important to keeping people on the platform, when they understand the breadth, It also may know that if they were only to share this information a single time, they'd be up against a pretty steep forgetting curve. Now, this is a real curve discovered in the 1880s by German psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus, who found immediately after we learn something, we begin forgetting it. And after our first day of exposure, we're lucky if we remember 1/3 of that information. I know, it may not bode well for everything here today, but that's okay, because luckily, researchers following Ebbinghaus's work found that repeated exposure to the same learning distributed at intervals over time could decrease or even eliminate this forgetting curve. In the teaching world, this is referred to as spaced repetition. In the product world, it's really about making sure we reinforce our core concepts and actions to make sure that they're not forgotten or lost in the grand scheme of all the experiences we have to deal with day to day. And it's another good reason why onboarding needs more than the first run experience in which to be effective. Now, those onboarding techniques we just looked at aren't just helpful for the initial onboarding of new users. They can also come in handy at other points in the user journey. For example, it can create an environment for continued discovery of new or existing features for our current users. For example, a few years ago, Etsy launched a new feature called Pattern. This pattern allowed its sellers to create a custom website design for its shop. So it had a mini onboarding experience to that feature. They had a banner allowing people to kind of jump into things from the seller dashboard. If they engage with that, they see their existing shop items are imported into a dashboard for Pattern, which familiarized them with the top features it could offer in customizing, but then led them through the process of trying out a theme on their own shop items and converting them into a state where they signed up for a free trial so they could try it out for 30 days. Sometimes we're not just introducing people to new features. Sometimes we redesign our product in such a way that core workflows might be altered. Onboarding techniques are necessary in this case as well to guide people through the change. The Google Drive team found this out a few years ago when they needed to introduce Docs user to the larger Google Drive product. And they captured their best practices for minimizing the aversion of change in a white paper called Minimizing Change Aversion for the Google Drive Launch. And some of their tips and best practices sound very familiar to those techniques we need to use for user onboarding, such as the need to familiarize someone with an impending change before it happens, or the need to guide someone between the differences of the old and new versions, and also the need to take time to learn from people about what could be improved for the larger launch for the entire world. And onboarding techniques can even help when you have cases where users have returned after a lapse in use. Sometimes lapses in use are a natural part of the usage cycle of some products, such as how some people only return to tax preparation software one time a year. This is a screenshot from TurboTax, a US tax preparation tool, and I've returned to it after a year of non-use. And so it takes time to familiarize me with what had changed in this version compared to last year's version, and also took time to learn what had changed in my own life so that it could update its recommendations. So onboarding techniques like these can be beneficial not just for new users, but across the customer journey at many different events in the user's cycle. And being able to envision these other opportunities for onboarding beyond the first run will make sure that we choose methods that aren't just limited to that first-time user experience, that can scale to support our users at many times. But it's not just enough to support multiple events over the customer journey. We also need to provide diverse methods of onboarding people in order to support people coming to our product in different situations. And that's because the path of user onboarding is not a fixed one that everyone's going to follow in the same way. You may have toiled away on a flow that goes from point A to point B, but then you'll quickly find person one needs a lot more support than you planned for. Or that person two can just breeze right through and doesn't need as much support as you thought. Or that person three takes a very roundabout and creative approach to things. And each of those paths are okay and will naturally need to vary because of different backgrounds people have with products of our type, with different expectations they may come into our product with, and even different preferences in how they like to try new things. And what teaching experts like Linda Nilsson remind us of is that people just learn new material best if they can learn it when they encounter it multiple times and through multiple modalities. That's actually great news for us because it means we don't have to waste our time struggling to try and design the one perfect onboarding experience that works for everyone. Instead, it just means that we have to invest in a little bit of a diverse toolkit of methods to onboard these users who are in different situations. I'm going to quickly walk you through 5 categories of guidance that I've found can help us diversify our approach. Now, the first category is the most foundational. This is the category of default experiences. We need to carefully consider what the initial state of our product or feature is communicating to someone seeing it for the first time. And that all starts with a really solid information architecture. The way we structure our content, the way we allow people to navigate that structure, and even the words we use goes the longest way in helping explain our product to new users. And the benefit of this approach is that it supports not just new users, but existing users in their day-to-day experiences. So having this good information architecture is really key. But defaults also come into play when we have empty states as well. Here's an example from a medical chat assistant app. And here it's asked a question and given the user, instead of a free-form text entry box, 3 boilerplate responses they might use to respond with. And this serves 2 purposes, right? 1, it makes it easier for someone to respond quickly, but 2, it implicitly guides someone on the scope of responses it can respond to. Other times you can deal with empty states by providing people with example content in place until they create their own. Here's someone who's just created an email account, and instead of being dropped into an empty inbox, they see a welcome email from the company dropped in there, which again helps guide them on what they can expect to do when they start receiving messages of their own. And even default settings can be really important. As Jared Spool found in one study he did on users of desktop computers, he found that less than 5% of them may have ever changed their default settings. So what all of this means is that if we take the time to choose the right defaults, we're setting people up for success. But if we don't spend enough time thinking about this, or if we choose the wrong defaults, we set people up for failure. So we need this strong foundation in place before we can imagine any other kinds of onboarding guidance to support people. Now, once you do have that foundation in place, then you can jump into other categories of guidance, like inline guidance, when you weave it into the flow of surrounding content or experience. Here's an example of inline guidance from Instagram. Every now and then, they introduce new features associated with stories. Instead of throwing a pop-up in the way or interrupting your feed, they just drop a new story at the beginning of the story feed at the very top. So you can get to it when you want to, and once you've watched it through, it behaves like all the other stories and kind of self-dismisses itself. Now, the third category of guidance is reactive guidance. This is when we show education in direct response to user action. And it embraces a very learning by doing approach. Here's one example of reactive guidance from Google Drive. Someone has grabbed files from their desktop over their web client, and you see this little reactive hint appear at the bottom of the screen, letting them know that as soon as they release those files, they'll be uploaded to the folder in view. And this is a great way where you can educate someone who wasn't familiar with this behavior without interrupting someone who already was. Now, the complement to reactive guidance is going to be, well, proactive guidance. This is when we try to show guidance in advance of when we think users should need to see it. Now, unfortunately, proactive guidance tends to be overused, typically in the form of overlays or pop-ups. But taking that approach can actually backfire on us because of something known as dual task interference. This is when we tend to ignore alerts or messaging that appear when we perceive them to be interrupting our current task. And sometimes for our users, interrupting their task could be interrupting them when they're just trying to open an app for the first time or just trying to read a page. And it's much better to time these things when there are natural pauses or to weave things into the natural flow or design of a product in order to make things feel more seamless. So let's take a look at an example of the latter, of something that feels like a natural extension of the product but is still proactive. This is an example from an app called Buddy Budget, a budgeting app. And as part of the first run experience, it simply asks a new user to enter the most recent expense they can remember. It doesn't ask them to set up a budget. It's not pushing a dialogue over the interface. It's just saying, hey, enter your most recent expense. And this is proactive, right? It's trying to get someone into a state where they have some information populated so that they're not dropping into an empty state of an overwhelming empty budget, right? This is being proactive, but still feeling like a natural part of the product. And then finally, sometimes, even though we might plan and try to anticipate where guidance needs to go, we will inevitably miss something because people have niche needs, and that's okay. That's why we just need to round out every onboarding toolkit with a good, on-demand, centralized resource for help and guidance. So that means centralizing your help content in one place, and even better is if you can indicate to new users during their initial onboarding experience how they can access it. Here's an example from Slack, where Slackbot, their onboarding assistant, is answering a query and just pointing people to deep links to their help center because it might not immediately know the answer to a question that is very unique to this user. So by having a diverse set of methods at our disposal, we'll have a series of backup solutions if people don't behave like we plan. For example, in that Buddy Budget example from earlier, we had that proactive guidance trying to encourage people to enter their first expense. Well, if they dismissed or otherwise ignored this, the empty state, that default empty state, also provided that same type of guidance in its own way, embedded on the empty home screen, pointing out where they could add this expense. So when you have guidance, the same kind of guidance presented in multiple ways, you're making your onboarding experience more accessible for a wide range of users. And again, you can help those people who come to your product in diverse situations still reach the same destination of success. So by supporting our users over multiple events in their journeys and by using diverse methods to support their different situations, we're building onboarding that has longer-term effectiveness and guidance in our products. And so now we get back to that question I asked at the beginning. Where does onboarding end? That's a question I don't just want you to think about for the rest of this conference, but a question I want you to take back to your teams. I want you to ask it if you're working on onboarding or if you may work on onboarding, because you're going to quickly find everyone has a slightly different answer to this question. And that might vary between different products or even between different users of the same product. And that's great. Embrace those differences because they are what will help you explain to your team why. We can't just design onboarding for the first run experience, but why we have to design onboarding to support our users for the long run. So if you'd like to take some time to reflect on your onboarding experience, there is a questionnaire you can go to. The URL's on this slide. I'll also tweet it out. But otherwise, I really thank you for your time today, and I can't wait to see what you do with your own onboarding experiences.